Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I have two ideas I want to talk about here in this introductory segment. The first one is that I've always wanted a budget handheld PC. What I mean by that is something that's around $300 or cheaper, but is small and portable, something that's a lot smaller than the Steam Deck, but I can take it around and play lightweight PC games, and then also some emulation up to maybe like PS2 and GameCube and beyond. To me, this is like the perfect sweet spot. There are so many nice indie games that I want to play that aren't available on Android or other platforms, and so because of that, a small budget Windows PC just makes a lot of sense to me. Now, the second thing I want to bring up is that today we're going to be reviewing the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition. And this is exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to size and performance. This is a small, compact PC that can play lightweight PC games as well as emulate all the way up to Wii U very consistently. However, between these two schools of thought, having a budget handheld PC and the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition, there is something that's off, and unfortunately it's the cost. This device is budget and everything but price. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the price here in a moment in the next segment, but what I want to talk about here before we get started is the fact that this is probably one of the most confusing devices I have ever reviewed. And that's because I honestly just don't know where this device fits within the entire market. And so hopefully, as I go through all the things that I do in my review, you can help me out and kind of figure out who this device is actually for, because personally, I'm at a loss. Either way, we've got a lot to unpack in this video here, and I want to make it as short as possible. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, as we get started here, I want to talk about price. After all, as a budget handheld PC, this is probably one of the most important factors. Now, anytime we talk about the AYANEO Air Plus, I think we also need to consider two other budget handhelds. The first that I want to discuss is the Anbernic Win600. This one came out around this time last year. This one had a starting price of around $325. You can get it for about $300 right now. Now, even though this one was the very first, it has quite a few issues. Number one, there is no micro SD card slots. You cannot actually put any additional storage unless you're going to use a USB flash drive. Another factor were the ergonomics. As you can see right here, the analog sticks are super low on this device and they're kind of outboard as well. What this means is when you try to play dual analog stick gameplay like this, it's not very comfortable. You don't want to do it for more than a few minutes at a time. And so instead, you're limited to basically like D-pad centric gaming, which is okay for some indie titles, but all the same, you really should be able to unlock the full potential of this device. Another mistake made by Anbernic is that they only use single channel RAM, and so because of that, the performance was much worse than it should have been with these chips inside. And so while yes, Anbernic was the first to get one of these handheld PCs to the market like this, it still was quite a bit expensive for what you were getting and had bad ergonomics and poor performance. And so because of that, this was a handheld that was really hard to love. Now, the thing is, right when the Win600 was launching, there was a big marketing campaign from two other companies, AYANEO and AYN. And both of these companies announced they were going to be releasing budget handheld PCs. They had a bunch of nice mock-ups and some price points, and because of that, the Win600 basically looked dead out of the gate. These other two companies were offering handhelds that had better chips inside and dual-channel RAM and micro SD card slots, and at prices that were competitive with the Win600. And both of these companies promised to get those devices released before the end of 2022. And so as the Win600 was launching, the going thought within the handheld community was just to wait for the other two. It's going to be about a 6-month wait, but you're going to get a much better device for your money. And I even made a video about all these different handheld PC releases. It was a very exciting time, and so I'll leave it linked down below if you want to go back in time and see what everyone was thinking. Now, the way this actually fell out is completely unexpected and different. Number one, we'll talk about the AYN Loki first. Now, when the Loki was first announced, there were something like 5 or 6 different models, the AYN Loki Max all the way down to the Loki Zero. And these were of various price points, but all the same, they looked to be a lot better than the Win600 and at a very decent price. Meanwhile, AYANEO was also working on their own entry-level or budget-level handheld PC, and they called this one the Air or the Air Plus. And these models had very similar chips to what you could find on the Loki and similar price points. These each were coming in at under $300. In fact, the original AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition, which we're reviewing today, had an early bird price of $279 with a retail price of $299. And at the same time, the budget versions of the AYN Loki were looking to come in around that price as well. well. And as you can imagine, those devices looked a lot more promising than the Win 600. Now, in the past year, a lot of things have changed. Let's start with the AYANEO Loki. This one was supposed to start releasing in Q4 of 2022. Now, here we are in June of 2023, and AYANEO has still not shipped a single Loki device. There are some review units going out. In fact, I think I should be getting mine next week, but all the same, there are no public releases of the Loki. And even then, the one that is coming to me is the Loki Max, so the 6800 high-end version. We still don't have anything within the budget realm from AYANEO at all. And along those same lines, there were many changes to the AYANEO Air Plus over the past year as well. If you remember, a moment ago I said that the early bird price of the i3 AYANEO Air Plus was going to be $279 with a $299 retail. And the i3 is now up on Indiegogo for ordering, but it is at a much higher price point. In fact, it's about $600 for the pre-release or early bird version, and then it's going to be between $650 and $750 retail for this budget-based handheld PC. And to their credit, AYANEO did a pretty good job of explaining why their price went up so high. They did this on their Discord server about a month or two ago. And in that post, the CEO explained a couple different factors. Number one is that the supplier ended up making the chip a lot more expensive, and then on top of that, the battery and the screen that they put in there is the high-end level one as well. And as a gesture of goodwill, when the crowdsourcing campaign first started, the company released a couple hundred of the budget AYANEO Air Plus models, the i3 and the Mendocino ones. And so these were going to be at around $279 each. Of course, those sold out in like 2 minutes, and so not many people got them. But the idea here was that they allowed these super fans to be able to get them very cheap. All the same, it doesn't change the fact that we're looking at a budget handheld PC that's coming in between $650 and $750 retail. And this is the reason why I'm talking so much about the price, because I think this is the crux of the video. We're talking about a budget handheld PC that no longer has a budget price. I personally think that $299 and below is the sweet spot when it comes to a Windows-based handheld. Now, I know a lot of people are probably tired of people comparing every handheld PC to the Steam Deck, but there's a reason. That $400 baseline price is basically the standard for any sort of budget handheld PC. And I think with this video in particular, comparing it against the Steam Deck actually makes the most sense. After all, the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition that we're reviewing today costs a lot more than the Steam Deck, but also has worse performance. And so at that point, it's really about whether or not you want to pay the money to have a smaller size. Anyway, I know I'm harping a lot on the price right here, but like I said, this is one of the most important aspects of buying a budget PC. In this one in particular, we're talking about a device that is no longer at a budget price, but still has a budget chip inside. So let's go ahead and move over to ergonomics and comfort, things like that, and then we'll finally get into performance. Okay, let's get started with the specs first. Now, the CPU we have inside is the Intel i3-1215U that has 6 cores and 8 threads. And this chip can be found in a lot of budget laptops, and the performance here is pretty decent. Now, there are 2 different models that AYANEO is offering, a low-spec and a high-spec model. The low-spec model has 8 gigs of LPDDR5 RAM, while the high-spec model, which is the one I'm reviewing here, has 16 gigabytes. And the clock speed on the RAM for both of these models is going to be 5200 megahertz. And there's also going to be a difference in storage depending on which model you get, 128 gigs for the low-spec or 512 for the one I have. Now, in terms of everything else, it's going to be the exact same with every other Air Plus model. So it's going to be the same 6-inch 1080p LCD display, and we're looking at 46.2 watt-hours of battery, which is bigger than the Steam Deck. Additionally, they all weigh about 510 grams, so that's also going to be quite a bit lighter than the Steam Deck too. In terms of connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2, and this is going to be running on Windows 11. And each of these models have some pretty nice components like Hall sensor analog sticks and triggers. Now, there's also some AMD versions of the AYANEO Air Plus, but I haven't been able to test those yet. But like I mentioned, the i3 model does have 2 different specs. And paradoxically, between these 2 i3 models, the low-spec one is currently more expensive. And that's because those $270 early bird versions already sold out. Regardless, right now it's going to be about $600 if you want to pre-order one of these i3 models. And when they go to full retail, the low-spec one will be $650 and the high-spec one will be $750. Now, I've already reviewed the other AYANEO Air Plus model that they had previously. This is the 6800U, and I made this video about 2 months ago. And when it comes down to it, other than the color and the chip inside, there is no difference between these 2 models. So they're using the same shell, same buttons, all that kind of stuff is going to be the same. And so because of that, I'm not going to explore too deeply in this video here about the AYANEO Air Plus because it's all found in that other video. So if you want to see things like size and weight comparisons and a deep dive into the screen, then I recommend checking out that video instead. All the same, I do want to do some quick impressions. So number one, you can see this color right here is what they're calling Glacier Blue, and it has a bit of a gray tone to it overall. I also like the silver color accents they have here on the trigger buttons and along the top. Additionally, the face buttons right here are uncolored, which looks pretty sharp as well. Now all these devices have Hall sensor analog sticks that are Nintendo Switch style. They're a little bit small for my tastes, but overall I think they are decent. This D-pad right here uses a rubber membrane connection with a nice classic retro feel. Same thing with the face buttons, these are also rubber membrane, but these are one of my complaints right here. I think they're a little bit too small, and I don't like the fact that they are so flat. I think if they were a little bit more rounded and larger, this would be just a better fit. Now the shoulders and triggers are relatively small but excellent. They're easy to press down on, and these triggers also have a magnetic Hall sensor, and they have a good amount of travel to them and feel very smooth to press down on. So really when it comes to controls, I think overall this is a very comfortable handheld to use with some minor complaints about the face button size. Up top, we have a power button with a fingerprint sensor that never really seems to recognize my fingerprint. Then we have our volume buttons up and down, then an LED charging indicator, and then finally a USB 4 port right here. Also up top, we have our exhaust vent, and then two little hotkeys on the sides of the shoulders right here. I like the fact that they're a bit subdued, but in practical use, they're kind of hard to reach when you're actually playing the device. So yes, they're a little bit hard to reach, but all the same, I appreciate the fact that we have them. On the bottom, we have two stereo speakers, another USB 4 port, a headphone jack, and then a micro SD card slot. One of the things that AYANEO loves to talk about with this device is that it only has two visible screws, which you can see here on the bottom. The rest are going to be hidden throughout the device. For example, within the micro SD card flap, you can see there's one right here. It's pretty cool that they've made it look so sleek, but it is kind of a pain in the butt to actually get inside the device. And here's a look at the back. We have a huge fan intake right here, and then we've also got some grips here along the sides of the controls. And these work out pretty well. They're not the most roomy or ergonomic of controls, but all the same, I do like the fact that we have these little bumps because it does make it just a little bit more ergonomic to hold in the hand. The only other comment I have about the overall design and the form factor is the thickness of the device overall. And that's to accommodate that larger battery, but all the same, this does feel like quite a thick device for how small it is. Either way, when it comes to overall comfort of just holding the device and playing, it's actually a very comfortable experience. Even though the size of this is about the same as the Nintendo Switch Lite, I would much rather play on this than the Switch Lite because of the ergonomics. And so if you are in the market for a small and comfortable handheld, I think the AYANEO Air devices are pretty good in that regard. Now another thing that comes with having a smaller handheld like this is heat. In particular, I found that with this specific model, the i3 one that we're testing here, anytime I tried to really push this device, anything from like 12 to 15 watts of a TDP, the device itself got noticeably warm, especially near the CPU. And unfortunately, because this device is so small, your fingers are going to feel that warmth. Specifically, this part right here, the inner part of the grip, was just a lot hotter than I was expecting. And unfortunately, it got to the point where it was so warm that I found it to be uncomfortable. Now, of course, every handheld gets hot, including the Steam Deck, but the thing is, they have so much space that you often won't feel that heat. Unfortunately, with the i3 model right here, if you are sensitive to having hot fingers like that, you're probably not going to like that experience. I guess the best way for me to describe it is that I was often reluctant to play any games that required a 15-watt TDP because I knew that within a few minutes, the whole experience was going to get pretty hot. And once we get to the performance testing, you'll find that that's kind of a bummer because there are many games that require a 15-watt TDP just to be able to play at full speed. Okay, moving over to software here, first note I want to make is that you will see some screen flickering in my footage. And I want to point out that this is something that got picked up on my camera, but not something you can see with the naked eye. Anyway, this right here is the IASpace app. This is basically AYANEO's front end. And I've talked about it in other videos, but basically this gives you some quick access options. For example, here is where you can control the TDP or power profile. By default, they have it set up with a 5, 8, and 15 watt TDP, but they also have what they call a Pro mode. That'll allow you to press the Y button and bring up whatever you'd like. However, bear in mind that the TDP limits are going to be between those 5 and 15 watts. So for me personally, I set it to 12 watts because I thought that was a good middle ground between 8 and 15. Now also within the iSpace app, you have the ability to browse your games list. This is going to scrub both Steam and things like the Microsoft Store, and so you can launch all your games from one central location right here. Additionally, within the Assistant tab, you have some functions that you can do as well. For example, within here, you can adjust things like your analog or trigger sensitivity, and you can also adjust things like the rumble. Personally, I found that I want this at the lowest setting possible because anything higher than that is just a little bit annoying. Also within the Assistant tab, you have the ability to adjust your RGB lighting around the analog sticks. Personally, I like just the default one where it shows blue and then it turns red when you plug it in to charge, but you have a whole spectrum of options right here, including different colors and brightness as well. Now, when you're in a game, you don't have to bring up the whole iSpace thing. Instead, all you have to do is press this bigger button on the right, and that'll give you a quick menu option. This will allow you to adjust things like brightness and TDP, and you can also adjust the screen resolution here on the fly. Now, when it came to my actual browsing and gaming experience, I mostly just used the big picture mode within Steam. This gives you a very similar experience to how it is on the Steam Deck, and so I've just grown really accustomed to this. But of course you have to bear in mind that most of my games are within the Steam library, so if you have a lot of games on Epic Game Store or GOG, you may want to use a different front end. Now when it comes to emulation, you have a bunch of different options, but for this video here, I decided to use Retrobat. And Retrobat is basically a Windows version of Batocera, which is one of my favorite Linux-based custom operating systems. And the setup here is pretty easy. You just install Retrobat and then add your ROM files to the folders that they indicate. And then from there, every time you launch Retrobat, it'll give you access to all your ROM collections right here. It'll even install the emulators for you. And so when it comes to the emulation side of this video, this is the setup that I used right here. And of course, like I mentioned, there are other options. For example, EmuDeck, which is available on the Steam Deck, is working on a Windows version. And that's currently in the testing phase, and I can't wait to show that one off. Now, before we get into game testing, let's do a quick audio test. Now, with every other AYANEO Air device, I have found that the sound has been a little bit quiet and muffled. And for each of my other devices, I've installed this app right here called FX Sound. So in my testing right here, I'm going to toggle between having FX Sound on and off. And this is going to be at 100% volume, so you can get an idea of how loud it's going to be. Overall, I would say that the audio quality on the AYANEO Air Plus is not the best, but FX Sound does help a lot. Okay, with all that testing out of the way, let's now get into performance. We're going to start at the lowest TDPs and play the most lightweight games and then move our way up from there. Like I mentioned before, the lowest watt TDP that you can have on this device is 5 watts. And I found that at that TDP, there are going to be some PC games that will play at full speed. However, these are going to be pretty few and far between. There were only a couple games through my entire library that actually played at 5 watts. And that included some of my most lightweight games like Sonic Mania and SteamWorld Dig 2. For the most part, Castle Crashers did play at a 5 watt TDP, but it would slow down here and there. Same thing with Celeste. Even though this one was showing 60 frames per second, it just didn't feel as smooth as I expected. Instead, I found that changing the TDP to 8 watts made everything perfectly smooth. And it turns out that this is basically the default TDP that you want to use when playing lightweight PC games. So really when it comes down to it, any of those lightweight indie games or 2D platformers, anything that's come out in the past 10 years that is relatively simple, there's a good chance that it'll play at full speed at an 8 watt TDP. Now, depending on the game, you may have to reduce the resolution down to 720p. Either way, you may have to fiddle around with the options here and there just to make sure that it does play at an 8 watt TDP. And for me, this is exactly where I want a budget handheld PC, to have a low wattage overall, but be able to play some of my favorite 2D or indie games. Now, as you start moving your way up from those very lightweight games to some that are more moderate, you are probably going to have to up the TDP to 12 watts instead. So when it comes to games like Hades, you'll have to play it at 12 watts, even at a 720p resolution. And there are going to be quite a few other platformers or side-scrollers that are going to be a little bit more heavyweight, and those will probably require 12 watts as well. I recently picked up this Humble Bundle right here, and it's a Metroidvania collection. And you can get the whole collection for about $15, and some of those proceeds will go to charity as well. And I tested out each of these games just to see how I liked them, and I found that most of them did require that 12 watt TDP. Now when it comes to 3D games, I found that many of them do not play at full speed at 12 watts. The only one I was really successful with was Portal 2. As you start working your way up, I found that many games are actually going to require that full 15 watt TDP. In particular, I found a certain pattern, and that is that most games that were released on either the PlayStation 3 or the Xbox 360 would play on this device, but it would require a 15-watt TDP, and you usually had to drop down the resolution to 720p as well. However, if you have any favorite Xbox 360 era games, things like Grand Theft Auto 5 or maybe the 2008 version of Prince of Persia, I think you'll find that the PC version of many of these games will play pretty well. Along those same lines, 3D-based PC games, things like Firewatch or Risk of Rain 2, these also played pretty well at a 15-watt TDP. I didn't get a full frame rate with all of these games, but all the same, I did find them to be very playable. I was also surprised to find that some games I thought were going to play just fine at a 15-watt TDP could not keep up. For example, Garfield Kart at 720p and low settings still would not get a full frame rate at a 15-watt TDP. Now, just to see how they would play, I did try some AAA games, and I tried to push the settings as low as I could to get the best frame rate possible. With Elden Ring, I actually got pretty close to 30 frames per second, but at a 720p with low settings, it doesn't look very good on the screen anyway. And probably the worst among the games I tested was Horizon Zero Dawn. This one I played at 720p low settings, and I also turned on the FSR to the highest performance that I could. The end result was unplayable to me. The frame rate hovered around 22 frames per second, and with all those FSR tweaks involved, it just did not look very good at all either. So there is definitely an upper limit on this device here, and it's going to be basically Xbox 360 era games. Okay, that's it for PC gaming. Let's now move over to retro game emulation. This is probably the most important factor for me with a budget handheld. And like before, we're going to start with a 5-watt TDP, but I was surprised to find how few games actually played at full speed at this wattage. When it came down to it, it was basically just NES games and then like Game Boy and Game Boy Color. When it came to Super Nintendo, I found that at a 5-watt TDP, most games are not going to play at full speed. If you look here at the top left, you can see that the GPU is really starved. We're only getting about 15 to 17% performance. Now, something I found that was kind of interesting is that at a 5-watt TDP, if you plug it in, the GPU utilization goes up to 20%. And all of a sudden, many games that did not play at a full speed now play at 60 frames per second, no problem. So if you are looking to play Super Nintendo games at that low 5-watt TDP, the only way I was able to get it working was when it was plugged in. And I'm not really sure why you would want to play something at a 5-watt TDP if you have it plugged in. Maybe you want to charge the battery as quickly as possible. Either way, yes, Super Nintendo will not run at full speed at a 5-watt TDP. Instead, I had to use an 8-watt TDP, and then it just worked fine. And it's going to be a similar story with other systems. For example, Sega Genesis, even Castle of Illusion will not play at full speed with a 5-watt TDP. Instead, bumping it up to an 8-watt TDP will give you the headroom you need. And it's a very similar story with Game Boy Advance. This one also crawls at a 5-watt TDP, but if you bump it up to 8, it's going to be fine. So really, when it comes to these classic 8-bit and 16-bit systems, all the way up through arcade, I found that an 8-watt TDP was best. And you can get some pretty good performance at this wattage. For example, the arcade version of Killer Instinct plays at full speed with an 8-watt TDP. I also found that PlayStation 1 did really well with an 8-watt TDP, even if you upscaled it to a 4x resolution. However, this was the last of the classic systems I was able to play at full speed when upscaled at an 8-watt TDP. From here on out, everything's going to require a little bit more juice. Next up, we have Nintendo 64. I found that a 12-watt TDP was necessary for most games to play at a 1080p upscale. However, some of those harder to play games required a full 15-watt TDP. And even then, there were some games, like Cruisin' USA, that had a little bit of slowdown here and there too. So this is a good example here where you're probably going to have to run this one at a 720p resolution in order to get a full speed. Moving over to Sega Saturn, I found that with a native resolution, you could play most of these games at a 12-watt TDP no problem. And it was a similar story with Sega Dreamcast. Some games actually would play at an 8-watt TDP with a 1080p upscale, but the vast majority of them would require that full 12-watt TDP. Along those same lines, the PlayStation Portable required a 12-watt TDP to be able to play at 1080p or a 4x resolution, but when you give it that much juice, every single game played just fine. Even Chains of Olympus played at a 4x resolution. Now, there are many systems that can play all the way up to PSP no problem. What I was most interested in was trying out GameCube and beyond. So let's go ahead and start with GameCube. I'm going to do a 3x resolution upscale, so a 1080p upscale. And I found that for most of these games, they will play at a 3x upscale at a 12-watt TDP. Now, other games like F-Zero GX required you to either bump the TDP up to 15 watts, or you could drop down the resolution to 2x or 720p. Either way, you have some options here, and yes, these games are all going to play just fine on this device. It's a similar story with the Nintendo Wii. I found that a 3x or sometimes a 2x resolution with a 12 watt TDP worked out really well. Moving along from there, we have the PlayStation 2. This one was a little bit harder to use than the GameCube. For example, I found that most games would require a 720p resolution if you were going to do 12 watts, and if you wanted the full 1080p experience of 3x resolution, you had to go all the way up to 15. And so as you can see in my testing right here, when using a 3x resolution, yes, I had to use a 15 watt TDP. And there were some games here and there, like God of War 2, that would require me to drop it down to a 720p resolution, but then also boost up the power profile to 15 watts. Long story short, every PS2 game I tried did work, but you did have to do some fiddling with the settings depending on the game. Now, one system I did not have success with was Nintendo 3DS. Even when pushing this to a 15 watt TDP and using a native or a 1x resolution, I could not get many games to play at full speed. For example, Mario Kart 7 just kind of dragged, and then also Metroid Samus Returns had quite a few glitches here and there when I was trying to play. And so based on my experience right here, I would say that the i3 version of the AYANEO Air Plus is not going to be a good fit for 3DS emulation. I also tried out just a little bit of PlayStation Vita emulation, and I found that the games that I tried, like Gravity Rush and Uncharted, did work at a full speed, but I had to use a 15 watt TDP. Now moving on from there, one system I was very excited to try was going to be Nintendo Wii U. In this one I found that I had to just set it to a 15 watt TDP and keep everything at a native resolution. But even then, I found that every game I tried played really well. Even Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild got me some pretty consistent performance right around 30 frames per second at that 15 watt TDP. So overall I would say I'm comfortable in saying that this can play up to Wii U with absolutely no issue. Another system I was interested in trying was PlayStation 3, and I found that many lightweight or 2D games did play at full speed, although I did have to try a 15 watt TDP. In particular, I found that role-playing games and racing games did the best. So if you have PlayStation 3 games like these that you want to try, I think they will play pretty well. However, once you start adding in 3D games, something even as simple as Dead or Alive 3 or Dead Souls, yeah, they're not going to play at full speed. So really, PlayStation 3 is going to be relegated to 2D and maybe some role-playing games. Okay, moving away from Sony, let's go over to Microsoft. Now, I tried out the original Xbox using the XEMU emulator. And this here is at a native resolution, but even then, I could not get a full frame rate with any game that I tried. And so unfortunately, I would say this is not a system that's going to be able to play the original Xbox. And as you can imagine, the next generation of Xbox systems, the Xbox 360, is also not going to play. In fact, every game I tried didn't even get past the title screen because I got at max about 6 frames per second. And so unfortunately, when it comes to Xbox emulation, even the original or Xbox 360, nothing's really going to play. Now, I didn't have a lot of high hopes for Nintendo Switch emulation, but I was surprised to find that the performance here was pretty good. For example, 2D games like Metroid Dread did play at full speed. Also, if you played some games in handheld mode, like Bowser's Fury right here, yes, at a 30 frames per second, this did play pretty well too. However, when you move up from there, even at that full 15 watt TDP, I found that many games had stutter on the Nintendo Switch. So Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, for example, would bog down quite a bit. This is one that I would probably just rather play on the Wii U. Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening in handheld mode actually did pretty well, but it did have some weird shading issues. For example, the sunlight didn't really seem to pop through when I was playing. And so just visually, this seemed to have some issues when trying to play this game. And then finally, when it comes to full 3D games, something like Super Mario Odyssey, yeah, this one definitely did not play at full speed either, especially when you got to the later levels. Okay, that's about it for performance. Now let's talk about battery life. And when it came to testing my battery, I did a few different real-world examples. Now for this test, I did focus on retro game emulation, but I tried it at different wattages of TDP, and so all you have to do is just look at the other PC games that we're playing and at what TDP, and then kind of extrapolate it from there. Either way, on the far right here, you can see that at the 5 watt TDP, there was not a lot that could play, but NES would. And when I played games at this power profile, I got over 4.5 hours of battery life. However, you have to bear in mind that 5 watt TDP is a really low wattage for this chipset. For example, it is very hard to navigate through Windows or any menu when you have a 5 watt TDP. It's really only going to work with certain very low-end emulation and then also some very lightweight games. So while it is true that you can get 4.5 hours of battery life, I don't think this is a very practical example. Instead, I think that 8 watts is going to be your best bet when it comes to low-end emulation as well as light PC gaming. And I found here that even at 8 watts, the battery life is not bad. We're looking at just under 4 hours altogether. Moving on from there, you can see that at a 12 watt TDP, I got a little bit under 3 hours of battery life. Again, I think that's actually pretty decent given the amount of power that we're actually pushing into this chip. And I also found that when you max things out at a 15 watt TDP, you can still get over 2 hours of battery life. A lot of that has to do with that larger battery that we have in the AYANEO Air Plus, but all the same, I think these are pretty decent numbers for an x86 handheld. Now, in addition to looking at the battery life right here, I did decide to compare it against another device just to kind of see what this is going to mean in context. And so here's a comparison with 2 different games on the Steam Deck versus the AYANEO Air Plus. If you look on the right side, you can see with SteamWorld Dig 2, this is a game that can run at a 5 watt TDP. And like before with the NES testing, I got about 4.5 hours of battery life on the AYANEO Air Plus. Now the Steam Deck has the ability to adjust the TDP, but I've always just kind of trusted the system itself to adjust it for me. And so here with SteamWorld Dig 2, all I did is just boot the game up and then let the Steam Deck OS actually adjust the TDP for me. And with a setup like that, I got 6 hours and 15 minutes of battery life. Also bear in mind that the resolution on the Steam Deck is higher than 720p. It has an 800p screen, and this has a smaller battery than the Air Plus as well. Now when we get to those harder to play systems, for example when trying to emulate Wii U with Breath of the Wild, I did find that the AYANEO Air Plus gave me about 15 minutes more battery life than on the Steam Deck. Now I think the Steam Deck overall is still more efficient, but the AYANEO Air Plus was able to brute force its way into having more battery life just based on the fact that it has that larger battery. Either way, my point here is that despite having a larger battery on the AYANEO Air Plus, the efficiency is not quite there at that Steam Deck level. So if you're really looking to play lightweight PC games, the Steam Deck is still going to give you the most battery life overall. Okay, so with all that testing out of the way, let's go ahead and wrap this up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition. And many of the things that I like about it are very similar to what we found on the original AYANEO Air Plus that I reviewed a couple months ago. For example, I like the fact that it has a nice portable size and it also has a very vibrant and rich screen. In addition, I think that the ergonomics on this device make it a very comfortable experience, and the fact that they have some nice components inside gives you a whole premium kind of feeling with this device. In addition, I think that having that larger battery does give you some decent battery life overall. Now, in terms of what I don't like, a couple of these are very similar to what I had in the previous video as well. For example, I still think these face buttons are too small and I wish they were rounded. Additionally, the texture on the plastic is a little bit slick and does attract fingerprints. Now, some things that are unique to the i3 version is number one, it gets pretty warm once you get to 12 watts and above. And I think it does get warm enough that it did prevent me from enjoying this device as much as I wanted. And finally, as I've mentioned a couple times already before, even though AYANEO is marketing this as a budget or an entry Windows handheld, I do not think this is a budget device. In fact, I think that's the main problem with these quote-unquote budget versions of the AYANEO Air Plus. At the very start, it did look like AYANEO was trying to make a budget device, but somehow along the way, they just lost sight of the fact that they were trying to make something budget. Instead, they kept adding premium components to something that was supposed to be low cost. And don't get me wrong, I think that the screen and the design is really excellent on this device. However, the AYANEO Air Plus i3 is no longer the device they set out to make. Instead, we got a device that has very premium quality to it and a premium price, but with a budget chipset and performance inside. And so, like I mentioned in the intro, I'm not really sure who this device is actually going to be for. As an example, let's take the $650 or $750 retail price of the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition. Between those two, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to get this $650 model, and that's because I think that 8GB of RAM is probably not going to be enough for this chip. And so really the only viable option between the two is going to be the $750 model. And if you're going to be spending $750 retail on a device, then I don't think that the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition is the one to get. I think you've got a couple options here. If you want that small form factor, then I think that the AYANEO Air Plus 6800U right here is going to be a better bet. This one will cost more. For example, it's about $800 right now with early bird pricing, and it'll go up to about $1,000. But with that price increase, you're getting an exponentially large increase in performance, the ability to basically emulate every system under the sun, and you're going to be able to play most PC games all the way up through AAA games as well. And if you don't mind going a little bit larger, then I would strongly recommend the ROG Ally instead. The high-end model of this one is coming in at $700, and I think that's a very reasonable price given the fact that this is a 7000 series chip, and that means it's going to be able to play everything no problem, and it has a 120Hz screen as well. And bear in mind, this is $50 cheaper than the retail version of the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition. Then finally, if size is not a consideration and you really just want to get the best bang for your buck, of course it's going to be the Steam Deck. The $400 model is going to be able to play everything that the Air Plus can and then some, and you're also going to get better battery life, more comfortable ergonomics, and a larger screen. At the end of the day, if the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition had come out at the $300 or below price that they had first advertised, this thing would have dominated the market. To put it frankly, this would have been everything that I wanted in a budget PC. But unfortunately at this price, I cannot recommend this handheld because I cannot see the value in this for anyone. But let me know in the comments below if you were able to figure out a use case that makes sense with the AYANEO Air Plus i3 edition. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we'll see you next time. Happy gaming.